Okay, in this video, I just want to go over an example of isolating data. We're still working on two sample hypothesis tests for the proportion. So what you have here are survey results. And I tried to put comments in so you can understand what the results mean. So there was a survey that was delivered to viewers of a particular TV station, and one of the motivations for delivering this survey was they had been getting phone calls about some of their programming being too violent. So the questions that they asked some of their viewers was gender, age, marital status, whether or not there were children present, income, how much TV they watch in terms of hours per day, and then what their perception of violence on that station actually is. For example, a 1 means that station's programming is much too violent, and a 5 means that they think that station's programming is not very violent at all. So, you know, this should be a good representation of the kind of data that you will get for your final. There are some questions that only have 2 responses. There are some questions that have 3 or 4 or 5 responses. And that's probably very similar to what you will see. So I wanted to do this to get you comfortable moving your data around and understanding different ways you could interact with it. In this particular example, we are not going to complete a test, but we are going to do some test setup that will hopefully get you ready for the homework problem, homework 10. So one of the questions is, does gender impact the perception of violence? And we would do a proportion test. So that second question is there. Is there a difference in the percentage of men and women that view programs as more violent? So this data is grouped in such a way, or it's probably easier to understand what the data is saying if we create a pivot table. So let's do that. And we're going to group by gender. But we want to look at or analyze that violent variable. So you could put it over here, or you could drag it up there. Now, the way the data is represented is using numbers, but it is not numeric data. They're numbers that represent categories. So we don't want to see the sum, we want to count. So you will need to change the field setting to count. And if we look back at the data, 0 is male and 1 is female. So there are 33 men that participated and 61 women. Great. What this does not give us is it does not tell us how violent they think the programming is. So that's one thing that's missing. So I am actually going to take gender and move it up to the top, and then I'm going to grab violent and put it where gender was. So now we can look at all the viewers that think programming is much too violent, and here that the programming is not very violent. One of the things that kind of jumps out of this graph is that no women pick that option. So no women think that TV is not very violent, or that station. So that's interesting. But we could put this in a chart if you like. One of the things you could see is women. There are more women that respond over toward the left, which is lots of violence. Men seem to be pretty even. Okay, so if the question is, does gender have an impact on violence? What you would need to do is to isolate which violent responses do you actually want to analyze. Maybe you want to look at something like, do what the data suggests to me as you look here. Do women think TV is more violent than men? Or is there a larger percentage of women that give TV a high violent rating? So what if we focus on the ones and the twos, which is lots of violence, moderate violence? So what if we look at the percentage of women here versus the percentage of men there? So from a numbers perspective, we're looking at 21 plus 14 women, 5 plus 8 men, out of all the women altogether. So 21 plus 14 out of 61 compared to 5 plus 8 out of 33. So that could be a test on, do women perceive programming as more violent than men? Maybe you come at this from a different angle. We go back to the graph. It looks like there are fewer women over here. So maybe we say, do men perceive programming as less violent than women? So it's, a different spin on the same data, but it forces us to look at a different part of the curve. For the second example, we could look down here. So it's the 8 plus 7 out of 33 versus the 10 out of 61. That was my choice to group these two categories together. Would you have to group any categories together? No, but that's a way for you to have a larger number of observations in your group, but you would not have to do that. One of the other questions is, does marital status or does the amount of TV impact the perception of violence? So what I would like you to play with is, you could do the same thing that we did with gender and do it with marital status, where you create a graph, and then what I would like you to do is upload your pivot table and graph, and then some verbiage about where could you take this test. The question is, does marital status impact the perception of violence? How do you want to take that? You could also do, does the amount of TV impact the perception of violence? So you could look at the people that don't watch TV hardly ever, or you could look at the people that watch lots and lots of TV and then see how the perception of violence plays out for those groups. I don't know, but I want you to get comfortable pivoting and graphing and using that to build a test. So for this, I mainly just want you to set the test up, or set up the statement that would feed into your hypothesis test. And then for homework 10, if you haven't looked at it yet, you'll see that it's the same kind of thing. I just want you to get a little more practice playing with the data. So for this one, this would be homework 10.2. I would like you to use this data file and the violence data and build out the marital status or the TV question, and I'm going to make that red for you, and develop the pivot table and graph, and I would like to see some verbiage to see where you could take that test. Thanks.